Welcome, and thank you for coming to the first annual Margaret Gray Thomas Lecture, sponsored by the Friends of the Owens-Thomas House. I'm Amari Williams-Alford, the Assistant Curator of Historical Interpretation and co-curator of the Roots and Rushes African-American Basketry of the Lowcountry, with my colleague Harry DeLorme, Director of Education and Senior Curator. We are excited to celebrate this exhibition with a talk tonight by a leader in studies of Black craftsmanship in the United States. Dr. Tiffany Momon is an associate professor of history at Sewanee, the University of the South, where she advances the field of public history through teaching research and community-engaged scholarship. Her work is dedicated to documenting and preserving African-American histories and material culture. Dr. Momon is the founder and co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive, a groundbreaking project that recovers and centers the lives and contributions of Black artisans and craftspeople in American history. Her current exhibition, Fighting for Freedom, Black Craftspeople in the Pursuit of Independence, traces the lives and experiences of Black craftspeople from the American Revolution through Reconstruction, emphasizing the many and varied ways they pursued and defined freedom in their own terms. Dr. Momon holds a bachelor's degree from Tennessee State University and the University of Memphis, and a master's degree and doctorate from Middle Tennessee State University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiffany Momon to Telfair Museums.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me here tonight in honor of Roots in the Rushes, African-American Basketry of the Lowcountry. And Amari, I would like to thank you for that introduction, and a special thank you for the invitation here to speak here tonight. I'd also want to mention and give a special thank you to everyone behind the scenes that made the reception and tonight's lecture happen. I love Savannah, and I'm so happy that I'm able to spend the evening here with all of you. And so today I want to start here. In the small town of Ripley, Tennessee, population of about 7,400 people, lies a grave marker. Ripley is just north of Memphis in West Tennessee, a stone's throw from the banks of the Mississippi River. In Canfield Cemetery, the Black Cemetery in Ripley, lies this grave marker for a woman named Cheney Giroux. I first saw this grave marker over 20 years ago. I have a very distinct memory of taking a photo of it on my digital camera, of all things, and being amazed that this grave marker was written in this way, that it told this woman's story in this way. I stored the photo away on some long-gone computer, and years later, when working on my family's genealogy, I discovered that Miss Giroux is my husband's relative. Her marker tells us that she was born enslaved in the Georgetown district in South Carolina in 1803. After the Civil War and emancipation, she moved to Lauderdale County, Tennessee, where Ripley is, with her daughter, Mary. Mary, Cheney's daughter, was born enslaved in 1848 and married into my husband's family in 1868. She died in 1927. And so it's unclear who put this marker up telling this story, but I am so glad that they did. You see, Cheney was my introduction to the rice culture of the Lowcountry. Each time I see a fanning basket, I think of her and Mary. And when I was invited to speak here today, I wasn't sure how I wanted to begin this lecture. I struggled to find my starting point. There's always a multitude of ways to start a lecture. And one day, after sitting at my laptop, trying out different entry points here, I suddenly remembered Cheney. And I went and searched for this photograph. And lucky for me, I'd been in Ripley just last year and had taken a new one. That story, Cheney's story, the story of Cheney and Mary and my family, led me today to the Georgetown district of South Carolina, which is where I would like to begin. And so by 1850, Georgetown, South Carolina was producing nearly half of America's rice. It was one of the wealthiest counties in the entire United States, with rice cultivation and the labor of enslaved people generating that wealth. A visitor to the area described Georgetown as, quote, the wealthiest portion of the state, but a more miserable collection of decayed wood domiciles and filthy beer shops that are clustered together to make up this town would be difficult to find. Another described the area as, quote, situated on a magnificent bay, a little below the confluences of 3 noble rivers, which drain a country of surpassing richness, and through the center of the finest rice-growing district in the world, the town is dead. Everything about it wears an air of dilapidation. So not much nice to say about Georgetown. And yet, despite its atmosphere, it was an economic powerhouse, specifically the plantations on the Waccamaw River and up the Waccamaw Neck. One enslaver's plantation alone produced 4 million pounds of rice in 1851. The last rice harvest before the Civil War yielded over 119 million pounds of rice. And so rice was the Lowcountry's defining crop. Everything folks knew about rice, how to grow it, care for it, nurture it, and yield a large harvest, was directly tied to the knowledge and labor of enslaved people. Newspapers carried broadsides, such as this one on screen, advertising the sale of, quote, 229 rice field Negroes, bragging that they were accustomed to the culture of rice and provisions. And while I'm speaking of the 1850s here, rice had always been big business in the Lowcountry. By the mid-18th century, South Carolina Royal Governor James Glenn declared, quote, the only commodity of consequence produced in South Carolina is rice, and they reckon it as much their staple commodity as sugar is to Barbados and Jamaica, or tobacco to Virginia and Maryland. And so taken together, the map and the broadside show the scale, the commerce, and the dehumanization tied to rice plantations. And so this is where Cheney and Mary were. This is what surrounded them, and this is what they experienced. And so the enslaved people brought to the Georgetown district did not arrive without knowledge. They came from the rice coast of West Africa, a region stretching roughly from present-day Senegal south through Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, where wet rice cultivation had been practiced for at least a millennium before Europeans arrived. This was not incidental. Early slave traders specifically sought and seized Africans who had the knowledge and ability to grow rice. Planters paid premium prices for enslaved people from this region precisely because of that expertise. Enslaver Elizabeth Alston Pringle once declared, quote, only the African race could have made it possible or profitable to clear the dense cypress swamps and cultivate them into rice by a system of flooding the fields from the rivers by canals, ditches, or floodgates, drawing off the water when necessary and leaving those wonderfully rice lands dry for cultivation. Historian Judith Carney, in her seminal text, Black Rice, argues that what was transferred across the Middle Passage was not simply labor. It was an entire system of knowledge that traveled from West Africa to the southeast coastal swamps of North America, knowledge about growing, milling, irrigating, and cultivating rice that no European enslaver possessed. And so this complex tidal plane, these cultivation systems and cultivation techniques that defined Lowcountry rice production bore direct relationships to the microclimates and farming methods of Senegambia and the Rice Coast. The extraordinary canal and trunk infrastructure that made Georgetown County's tidal plantations possible was built by people who already understood how rice and water moved together. And so the transatlantic transfer of rice cultivation marked not simply the movement of an entire crop across the ocean, but it also marked the forced relocation of an entire culture. And the map here to the left of the Georgetown district shows you several of those plantations there, such as Forlorn Hope, Caledonia, Midway, True Blue, and more. And so this culture and its knowledge belonged especially to African women who lived in those coastal rice-growing zones between Senegal and the Ivory Coast. The fanning basket, West African in form, West African in technique, woven from the grasses of a low-country marsh that echoed the wetlands of home, was part of that transferred knowledge system and that forced relocated culture. The basket did not appear in Georgetown County by accident. It arrived with the people who knew how to make it because they already knew what rice required. And so at the center of Georgetown's rice economy were these baskets, such as those pictured on screen from the collections of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, and the basket at the bottom of the screen from the collections of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. After harvest, enslaved workers threshed the rice, pounded it to remove the husk, and then tossed it into fanning baskets, these coiled baskets of that West African form, so that the chaff blew away in the breeze. The basket was not incidental to this economy. It was structurally embedded in it. Without the basket, you would not have clean rice. And without clean rice, there was no wealth. And so the most valuable county in the United States ran, in part, on baskets made by enslaved hands. And so the baskets of the Lowcountry are not simply beautiful objects. They are the material evidence of a knowledge system that survived the Middle Passage. This coiled basketry, built by wrapping and sewing bundles of grass into form, is a West African technique with roots stretching back centuries. The materials changed when the landscape changed. However, the knowledge did not. Often, enslaved men gathered bulrush from the marsh, passing those materials on to women who then sewed the coils. The basket that emerged was neither purely African nor purely American. It was diasporic, made in a new place from a new landscape with knowledge from a previous place that refused to be lost. And so we will never know if Cheney and Mary made baskets such as these because the archive does not provide us with that information. It's gone quiet. It is more than possible that they used baskets like these, of course. And while the historical record cannot give us all of the answers, there are a few things that it cannot take away from us. And that was the information left by one of my husband's relatives on Cheney's grave marker. We know that Cheney and Mary were in the Georgetown district, that they knew the landscape, that they knew the marsh, that they knew rice culture, and that after the Civil War, they built a life that brought their story all the way to Savannah today. And sometimes the most honest thing a historian and an audience, and I'm looking at all of you out there, can do is to stand in the gap between those facts of what we know and what we don't know and refuse to look away. Not to invent what isn't there, not to claim more than evidence allows, but to insist that the gap itself is meaningful, that the silence has a shape, that the absence has a cause, and that naming both is a form of historical truth. And so the archive did not fail to record Cheney and Mary by accident. It was never designed to record them at all. And standing in that gap means refusing to let the archive's indifference become our own. The Roots and the Rushes exhibition is refusing to let the archive's indifference become your own. That entire exhibition lives in this gap. And so the archive was not built for Cheney or Mary. It was not built for the women who made these baskets, sold them at market, or carried them out of bondage. Archives built under slavery were designed to record property and profit and productivity, and not the inner lives, the skilled hands, or the daily movements of enslaved people. And so the gaps in the record are not accidents of history, they actually are history. And to study enslaved women in basketry in the Lowcountry is to learn to read what is not there as carefully as what is. And so when I started the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive in the fall of 2019, I really just had an idea. I was sitting at my desk in my basement office with no windows, And I was thinking about what I could do. I'd had this itch to start this archive for a while. And I called one of my best collaborators, Dr. Torrin Gatson, and I told him my idea. And he stopped and he said, well, if you don't do it, I will. And so with that, I stopped at that moment and pulled out my debit card and bought a website. I knew nothing about making a website, but I aligned myself with folks who did. I fundraised like crazy. I got the respect and the resources from my peers, and I made what you see today, along with a team of brilliant scholars. I had wondered what it would be like to have a decorative arts archive that focused solely on enslaved and free Black people. And this wouldn't be an archive like previous archives that operated under weird boundaries. And by weird boundaries, some decorative arts archives won't record enslaved people unless a name is attached to the record. But as we know from going through the records, you often won't have a name. And so the BCDA was born to be a living aggregated digital archive, one that grows and changes. But most importantly, it would rest on understanding the context of Black life. And so at the BCDA, we research Black craftspeople through these three avenues of sources, objects, and place. And for sources, we turn to any primary source that we can get our hands on, whether they be census records, wills and estate papers, runaway advertisements, broadsides, or sales records. We read sources against the grain, actively looking for mentions of Black craftspeople in the margins. And next, we turn to objects. And of the objects, we step away from your typical art historical connoisseurship practices, and we center the maker. And I should mention here that I am a public historian, and so every time I speak at an art museum, I'm always wondering if they're going to find me out. And so we ask ourselves a variety of questions about the maker, all in an effort to mine the gap. And lastly, we turn to place. And when we examine place, we are interested in the impact a place has on a person and the way that a person impacts a place. And what rests at the core of this project is finding Black craftspeople and telling their stories through what we can learn about their lives, the objects they created, and the places that they impacted. And trust me, looking for Black basket makers, especially Black women basket makers, was no easy task. What you see on screen is a list of over 250 occupations and trades held by enslaved people prior to the end of the Civil War. And this appendix appears in the back of a book called The Other Slaves, edited by Ronald Lewis and James Newton. And that book itself is an act of minding the gap, insisting that the labor history of enslaved people was far more complex and skilled than the historical record typically acknowledges. And I've placed a little red star there on screen next to the basket makers. So find it. It's up there. It takes a moment, maybe, but that is the point, right? And so this list is one of my favorite documents in the scholarship on enslaved labor because it does something the plantation record almost never does. And that is that it refuses to reduce enslaved people to a single category of field hand or domestic worker. Here are blacksmiths and midwives, coopers and engineers, silversmiths and sailors, musicians, mathematicians, and mantua makers. And the range here is staggering. The depth is humbling. Enslaved people were doing everything, building everything, healing everyone, making everything. And the historical record spent 2 centuries pretending otherwise. But look at where the basket maker sits on that list. Now imagine looking for the woman behind it. The list names, of course, the trade. It does not name the person. It does not tell us whether those basket makers were men or women, young or old, from Georgetown or the Georgia coast. It does not tell us how many baskets they made, who bought them, or what became of that knowledge when slavery ended. It makes the category known, but that's as far as it can take us. That star, that notation there, tell us that they existed. So now let me try to tell you who they were. It is difficult to find enslaved women recorded specifically as basket makers in the same way that women who were recorded, enslaved women were recorded as dressmakers, knitters, or seamstresses. And while the archive may not record the exact names of or the women associated with that practice in large numbers, we know that they were making baskets and doing so often. What we also know is that a great deal of women who were either making baskets, using baskets, or even selling baskets were known as market women. And so let's go to Charleston for a moment. And so the enslaved market women of Charleston were not a single type. They were washers and cooks, hucksters and fruiterers, seamstresses and basket makers. Some sold goods their enslavers produced. Some sold goods they produced themselves. Some did both. And what they shared was the basket as a container, as display, as transport, as trade good itself. The woman who carried fish to market carried them in a basket. The woman who sold vegetables carried them in a basket. The woman who made and sold baskets was both producer and vendor, the beginning and the end of that economic chain. And so I want to spend some time with these women, and not really with the system of rice cultivation that surrounded them. Many scholars have done that work. But I want to spend some time with them, with what their days looked like, what they carried, what they risked, and what they built inside the very narrow margins the world allowed them. And so the archive, as I mentioned, is not generous with their stories, but it's not entirely silent either. And if we read carefully enough in the right places against the grain of what those documents were designed to tell us, we find them. So let's take a look. One of the earliest mentions of a market woman in a Charleston newspaper is found in the December 3rd, 1772 edition of the South Carolina Gazette. As pictured on screen, the newspaper notice advertises an auction of the estate of a Mrs. Mary Perrineau in the Ansonboro neighborhood of Charleston. Among those listed as part of her estate is, quote, a valuable house Negro. Also a woman described as, quote, one wench with her child, who is a very good cook, house wench, and market woman. And so Mary Perrineau's last will and testament, dated October 21st, 1772, might provide us a clue to the identity of the enslaved market woman. Perrineau's will mentioned an enslaved woman named Dolly, with two enslaved children named Serena and Memvia. The document also mentions enslaved women named Hannah and Tay, highlighted there for you on screen. And perhaps the market woman was one of them. In 1772, the market woman's neighborhood of Ansonboro, outlined in the red dotted line on the map, sat just outside of Charleston's walled settlement. The neighborhood was originally bounded by Calhoun, Anson, Meeting, and Society streets, as outlined by the dark blue lines. It was the city's first suburb, newer and less crowded than the streets inside the gates, but no less entangled in the economy of slavery that ran through every neighborhood on the peninsula. The homes here were described as proper townhouses with gardens, respectable, prosperous, aspirational buildings. But behind those townhouses were the outbuildings and slave dwellings where people like Dolly, Hannah, and Tay lived in the narrow spaces that wealth required but did not acknowledge. For the market woman described in the advertisement, Ansonboro was both home and workplace. She would have known these streets with an intimacy that only comes from moving through them every day, basket on head, child nearby. She knew which households bought what, which vendors occupied which spots at the market, which routes were fastest, and which drew the least amount of scrutiny. She carried that knowledge with her as she moved throughout the neighborhood. And so the newspaper notice that preserves her existence was not written for her, it was written to sell her. And she appears in the archive at the moment of her greatest vulnerability, the death of her enslaver, the dispersal of the household, the auction that would separate her from everything she knew, possibly even her own child. And so perhaps she was Dolly, perhaps Hannah or Tay, we cannot say. But what we can say is that she was there in Ansonboro in 1772, moving through streets that today no longer remember her, likely carrying a basket that she made with her own hands. And much like the previously mentioned enslaved woman, Charleston city newspapers also recorded the presence of Tina, also an enslaved market woman, at one of her most vulnerable moments, the moment she decided to self-emancipate and free herself. And what the runaway advertisement tells us is that her name was Tina, that she was well known as a washer and a market woman, which means that she had been there long enough and was present enough that the city knew her face and her name before her enslaver ever put them in a newspaper. Her enslaver, M. Donovan of King Street, offered $5 for her return. All persons were cautioned against employing her. And I want you to read that line carefully. All persons are hereby cautioned against employing the above runaway. Tina was not hiding. She was working. She had taken the skills that Charleston's market had given her, the relationships, the routes, the reputation, and she used them to build a life outside the household that claimed to own her. The market that surveilled her also liberated her. She knew it and she used it. Tina did not simply self-emancipate from a household. She ran toward a market that she already knew how to work. The skills that made her valuable to Mr. O'Donovan were the same skills that made her dangerous to him, because she did not need him to survive. The market woman who hired her own time, kept her own customers, and carried her own baskets through the streets of Charleston was practicing a form of freedom that the law refused to recognize and the system could not entirely prevent. And so we do not know if Tina made baskets, but we know that she was a market woman, and we know that she carried herself through the streets of Charleston with enough confidence and enough recognition that her enslaver's most urgent warning was not that she had fled, but that she might find work. And so the archive preserved her name because her enslaver wanted her back. What it did not preserve was the rest of her story. And then there was Peggy. She was 40 years old, round-faced, quick in answering when spoken to, which is to say that she was sharp, present, and not easily intimidated. The runaway advertisement tells us that she passed through at least 3 households as an enslaved woman before her enslaver, Richard Clark, placed this notice. She had been the enslaved property of John Giles on Queen Street, then the enslaved property of a Mr. Keating, and then Mr. Keating died. Mr. Clark purchased her from Mr. Keating's estate. In the space of just a few years, Peggy had been sold at least twice, moved between households, separated from whatever stability she had built, and still, through all of it, she remained a well-known market woman. And so to me, that detail is everything. She's well-known. The market remembered her when the households that claimed to own her changed. Her customers knew her face. Her reputation had survived the sales. And when she self-emancipated from Richard Clark on the 18th of June, she did not disappear into the unknown. She went toward something. And that something was her husband, Ned, who belonged to Mrs. Broughton in Charleston. She likely went to him, and she used that same knowledge of Charleston streets, households, and networks that the market had given her. And she built a life that the archive described as harboring, but one that we might call home. And so the enslaved woman I will speak about next is about 50 years old. She's a good market woman. Her daughter, standing beside her, is 19 years old and described in a single phrase that the archive clearly intended as a selling point, and that was that she was smart. And so think about what that word might have cost. Smart. Written by someone who saw these 2 women as inventory, who was trying to attract a buyer, and who had no interest in honoring either of them. And still the word smart came out. And the 19-year-old daughter of a good market woman was so visibly capable that even a sale notice had to acknowledge it. But what did smart look like in 1790s Charleston? It looked like a young woman who had watched her mother work the market for years, who knew the routes, the customers, the prices, the rhythms of the city, who had carried baskets alongside her mother long enough to know what went in them, what they were worth, and how to move through the streets of Charleston with purpose and without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Her mother had taught her, the market had taught her, and now Mr. William Allen of Blake's Wharf was selling that education to the highest bidder. And we do not know their names. But while we do not know that, we know that they belonged to each other. We know that the mother was good at her work and the daughter was smart, and that the knowledge passed between them the same way that basket-making knowledge passed between women hand to hand year by year was what she would keep with her. And so this is what the varied experiences of these market women keep returning to us. Not just the woman at the market stall, but the woman at home teaching her daughter what the market required. Not just the basket sold, but the knowledge of how to make it, how to fill it, how to carry it, and turn it into something that sustained her. The market woman was not only an economic actor, she was a mother, a teacher, a keeper of knowledge and survival. And that basket that she carried to market was part of the same labor that kept her family together. And that is one of the fullest pictures of who these women were. And together, all of these pictures, all of these descriptions of women and these advertisements keep reminding me of Cheney. And so this brings me to the story of Louise. And I want to point out a few things here that this advertisement highlights. And that's first, that her name was Louise. But if you look down at about the third row of the advertisement, you see where her enslaver wrote that she was of the Congo Nation. So Louise was of the Congo Nation, about 30 years old, 4 feet 8 or 9 inches tall, round-faced, dark complexioned, and branded on her right shoulder. She spoke English tolerably well, and when she left her enslaver, Follette Ferret's household on the corner of Meeting and Hazel Streets, she was wearing a pink cambric jacket, a blue-striped dimity petticoat, and a check apron. And she was carrying a round basket with cakes and a huckster's badge. And so when I stumbled across this advertisement and saw that she was from the Congo, she had a huckster's badge, one of the slave badges that Charleston is often known for, and that she was selling cakes, I paused for a moment. And so what I also thought about was that she left with her badge. She left dressed for work, not for hiding, not for flight into the wilderness, but for the streets of Charleston, where a woman carrying a basket of cakes and wearing a huckster's badge was exactly what she appeared to be, a market woman, going to market, unremarkable, invisible, free. Louise was of the Congo Nation, which meant that she had crossed the Atlantic, possibly survived the Middle Passage, been branded on her right shoulder, learned enough English to get by, and she also found a way to leave. She did not leave empty-handed, as we know. She left with the one object that made her legible in the city and invisible at the same time. And so the basket was her cover and her livelihood and her freedom all at once. And so this particular basket, held in Louise's hands, becomes a basket of liberation, not as a metaphor, not as an argument, but as a fact. Louise walked out of bondage on September 23rd, and her enslaver, Follette Ferret, offered $6 for her return. We do not know if anyone collected it. We do not know where Louise went. But we know she probably knew exactly where she was going when she picked up that basket and decided not to return. And so at the beginning of this section, I said I wanted to spend some time with these women, not with the system around them, but with them, with what they carried and what they risked and what they built inside the very narrow margins that the world allowed them. And together, we went looking for them. We went into the newspapers and the estate notices and the runaway advertisements to find them. Not clearly, but found them enough. And so when I think about these women together, here we have 5 women, 5 stories the archive told, 5 lives assembled from the wreckage of documents that never cared about them. And that is what minding the gap looks like. You go in knowing that you will not find everything. You may not find much of anything, but you go in anyway. And sometimes, if you read carefully enough, in the right places against the grain, they find you. And so craft scholar Namita Gupta-Wiggers writes about what she calls the craftscape, a framework that connects people, place, institutions, and objects through cultural flows. The craftscape encourages us to think about the object not as the end point, but as a catalyst for conversations on process, cultural and material histories, the importance of the land, biography, and narrative. And so the Charleston market, and really the city of Charleston or even the city of Savannah, are all craftscapes. They are precisely the kind of spaces Wiggers is describing, a place where people, place, objects, and cultural flow converged, where the basket moved between maker and buyer, between West African tradition and Lowcountry landscape, between the plantation that demanded it and the women who used it, where Tina and Peggy and Louise and the unnamed women we've been following moved through a landscape of craft knowledge that was simultaneously economic, social, cultural, and deeply, yet stubbornly, alive. And so what Wiggers gives us is this theoretical language for something that these women were already practicing. They were building a craftscape. They had been building it since their first coiled basket was sewn. And the market was where that craftscape became visible, where the object and the maker and the place and the knowledge all came together in a very public way, out in the open, on the streets of Charleston, in full view of a city that tried to contain it and could not. And so the craftscape that these women built did not end when the market closed. It did not end with emancipation or Reconstruction or Jim Crow. It is on Highway 17 in South Carolina. It's at the Charleston City Market. It's in this room. It's in this museum. It's in the exhibition. And so when I thought about the market a little bit more, as I was trying to see these women and come close to understanding their experiences, I began to think about the market as a sacred space. It was not only a place of commerce. And for the women that we've been following, it was the one place in antebellum Charleston where something approaching a public life was possible, where they could speak to each other, where they could be known by their own names rather than that of their enslavers. And this is a painting by a gentleman named Charles Hamilton in the collections of Colonial Williamsburg of Charleston and the city market there in 1872. And what I did after staring at this painting for a while was to try to pull out as many of the enslaved women in their baskets as I possibly could. And so when I think about what they might have experienced at the market, where they could be known by their own names, where they could speak to each other in private, I really began to think about that relationship that they had with each other that became apparent when they saw each other in the market. I thought about how it might have been loud and crowded and chaotic enough that conversations happened that no overseers or enslavers could fully track, where women who sold alongside each other week after week built something that no archive has a category for. And that friendship, that solidarity, that network, that community among enslaved women became clear as day. They watched their children. They watched each other's children. They warned each other about the constables. They passed information about households, about enslavers, about who could be trusted and who could not. Some of them likely spoke Gullah in the market, that language that had crossed the Middle Passage and that had come to the southeast coast of the Lowcountry and moved through the crowd like water, carrying news, warnings, comfort, and knowledge in a tongue that belonged to them and not to the people who claimed to own them. And they likely talked about baskets, who had what materials, whose work looked the best, who needed help with a coil, whose technique had come from a relative or a friend, who had learned at the market itself how to make these baskets. And so the basket moved through that social world in the same way it moved through the economic one, as a currency, as a connection, as the tangible evidence of a knowledge system that the market kept alive, the same way that the marsh kept the grasses alive. And so when I think about the women that we previously discussed, I think about how they had each other, right? How the market was where they found each other. It was where they built the thing that the archive refuses to name, but that every one of their stories points toward, and that's a community of peers, of friends, of knowledge, of craft, or survival, held together not by documents or institutions, but by the daily act of showing up, basket in hand, and seeing each other. And thinking through the women who made baskets and used baskets, whether they were fanning baskets or market baskets, I began to wonder about the multiple uses of these baskets. Newspapers are abundant with phrases such as baskets of salt, of wine, cake baskets, fruit baskets, and the like. But I began to think beyond that, and I became curious about the basket as a tool for liberation. And I'll admit here, I was inspired by the previously mentioned Louise, who, if you remember, self-emancipated carrying a basket of cakes. And when I think of her, I think of how the basket was many different things, depending on the moment, and that enslavers often never fully understood what they were looking at when they were looking at those baskets. And so the first basket was the one that the plantation demanded, the fanning basket that separated the rice from the chaff, the carrying basket that moved goods from field to storehouse, the market basket that held the produce, the fish, the cakes that enslaved women sold on behalf of their enslavers who collected the profit. And that was the basket that the city knew. It was the basket that was required. And then I thought about the second basket, the one that the plantation never anticipated, the one that Louise knew, the one that she carried when she self-emancipated, the one that likely didn't flee into the marsh or disappear into the night when she walked the city looking exactly like she was supposed to as a market woman going to market. And I thought about that because I'll be honest, I'm super curious about Louise's strategy here. Her thought process and what she thought about in that moment. But Louise was not alone in that understanding with that idea of packing a basket before self-emancipating. Runaway advertisements of antebellum cities such as Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans describe freedom seekers carrying baskets with some regularity. Some had a basket of clothes, a basket of provisions, a basket of goods. The runaway advertisement writers noted these details because they thought that the contents might help identify the person carrying them. What they did not understand, and maybe never understood, was that the basket itself was the strategy. And so take, for example, Judy, in the advertisement pictured here on screen from the New Orleans Daily Times Picayune newspaper. She was about 40 years old, 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, with gray hair, slow in her gait, with 5 upper teeth missing. She wore a light cotton dress and a handkerchief on her head. And when she left L. Lambert's household at the corner of Dryades, and I know I'm butchering that street, and Triton Walk, she took up with her a market basket. And so Judy was not young, she was not fast. The advertisement describes her gait as slow, which is to say that whoever wrote this advertisement did not expect her to be hard to catch. And yet she went anyway. On a Thursday in April, she picked up her market basket and she left. And the advertisement supposes that she was enticed away by a white man speaking English headed to Mobile, Alabama. Perhaps Judy, 40 years old, gray-haired, slow-moving, was just done. And she picked up the one object that made a woman moving through the streets look like she was going about her own business and walked away from everything that L. Lambert thought he owned. And so that market basket, it was her cover. It was her companion. It was one of the most ordinary objects in the city. And in Judy's hands, it was the instrument of her freedom. Steamboat captains were cautioned against taking her away from the city, which suggests that someone understood exactly how far a woman with a basket and enough determination could go. And so when Judy took her basket and walked towards freedom, just a generation later, freedom came for everyone. And so that transition from plantation labor to free labor in the Lowcountry was neither clean nor swift. Reconstruction promised much and delivered little, and the land that formerly enslaved people had worked, farmed, and in some cases briefly possessed, attempted to claim them once again. The rice economy itself collapsed within a generation. The tidal infrastructure fell into disrepair. The market shifted. The plantations that had defined Georgetown County's wealth for over a century simply stopped producing in some instances. The world that had demanded the fanning basket, in many ways, was ceasing to exist. But the basket itself did not cease to exist. It outlasted the rice economy that created. It outlasted white supremacy. It outlasted Reconstruction. It outlasted the sharecropping system that replaced plantation slavery in name, but not always in practice. And it outlasted Jim Crow, the Great Migration, the systematic dismantling of Gullah Geechee communities along the coast through development and taxation, and the same forces of erasure that had always worked against people. And it outlasted all of it because people kept making them. People still continue to make them. People keep teaching each other, mothers teaching daughters, grandmothers putting tools into the hands of children and showing them how the coil worked. Because the knowledge had always lived in the body rather than the document, and it could not be confiscated when Reconstruction ended, or sharecropping began, or the highway cut through the community, or the developer purchased the land. And so sometime after 1865, Cheney Giroux and her daughter Mary left Georgetown County, South Carolina. We do not know exactly when. We do not know how they traveled, whether they walked or rode or found passage along the waterways that had defined the landscape of their entire lives. We do not know if they left with others or alone. We do not know if they ever looked back. What we do know is that they left and that they went together. And so I'd like to imagine that when Cheney made her way from the coast of South Carolina to essentially the coast of the Mississippi River, that she carried a piece of South Carolina with her, and not just as a sentiment, but as a survival. Maybe she traveled with rice to cook on the journey, maybe a basket, maybe a handful of bulrush, pressed flat and dried. Carry it the way you carry something that you're not ready to leave behind. Although the archive cannot tell us this, but we've spent almost this entire evening learning that the archive's silence is not the end of the story. It is an invitation to imagine carefully and honestly what their lives might have been like. And we do know that when she arrived in Lauderdale County, that Mary was with her. Together, they built a life almost from nothing. Cheney purchased land. She later built houses. She became a successful businesswoman in a county that had no particular reason to make any of that easy for her. And when she died in 1890, someone thought that her story was worth carving into stone in that grave marker. And if you look on screen there, you can see where it says Cheney Giroux with an X in the middle. And above and below the X, it says her mark. So that's her signature there on her last will and testament document. And so what passed down from Cheney to Mary and from generations of women to their descendants was the craft. And this teaching happened in places that was not often documented, but sometimes it was. Take, for example, this photograph titled Learning to Make Baskets from the St. Athanasius School in Brunswick, Georgia. This school operated from 1884 to 1928, and this photograph on screen was taken there in 1923. And so what I notice about photographs such as these are what their hands are doing, how their hands are bent, how they are holding things, how they're in community with each other, crafting and making, and how they're carrying on that tradition that so many women before them had. That tradition here through this photograph, we can see how they were honoring it, honoring what someone had taught them. That was very much so like a chain, connecting one generation to the next. And so when my latest exhibition, Fighting for Freedom, Black Craftspeople in the Pursuit of Independence, opened at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum in Washington, D.C. in March of 2025, I knew we needed to have a fanning basket in the show. And so we used the basket that I showed you a few slides back from the collections of the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. And we placed it in a case with pottery from Texas, from New York, and silver spoons from St. Croix in Philadelphia. And so when this exhibition opened, and it was about Black craftspeople, their pursuit of independence, economic independence, personal independence, the kind of independence that comes from owning your skill and your labor through the objects that your hands produced. I knew that a fanning basket belonged in that conversation because it is one of the most powerful examples we have of an object that lived simultaneously inside bondage and continues to live outside of it as an African art form. And so we partnered with MESDA on this exhibition, and they gave us a few of their objects, but the fanning basket was my favorite. And I thought about it as I stood in the gallery and watched visitors move throughout the cases. And I thought about it because a woman there told another that she'd never seen one of these before in person. And so I thought about how that basket in that case was the real thing. And I thought about it, and I've held it in my mind because I can't fully explain the woman's expression when she was describing it to a friend. But there was something in there that made me smile and that made me happy that we had the basket in the show. But I also thought about all of the baskets that we do not have. The ones that possibly rotted away in the marsh, the ones that were used until they fell apart because these were utilitarian objects. The ones that were never collected because no institution thought to collect them. And so I thought about them this way because every basket that we do have is a miracle of that survival, right? And every basket that we do have reminds us that those objects survived the gap. And so fighting for freedom was about refusing those silences. It was about standing in front of objects made by Black hands, insisting that the maker's story is as important as the object's beauty. It was about doing the work like you all have done here with Roots in the Rushes. It was about doing the work and us having this conversation here tonight. It was about minding the gap. And so one of the things that came out of this exhibition were all of these sticky notes. And we placed them on a vinyl image of the White House, and we invited people to leave us comments. And we got a variety of comments. Folks drew pictures, folks thanked us for the show, folks talked about the creativity that they saw in the room. And so I very much so enjoyed reading this feedback and thinking about the way that exhibitions such as this one, such as Roots in the Rushes, touch people. And so what Roots in the Rushes tells us is that the objects on display in those galleries deserve our full attention, that the makers behind those objects deserve to be found, that the gap between what the archive preserved and what it refused to preserve is not a dead end, but it is an invitation. It's an invitation to look more carefully, read more honestly, and refuse to let the silence be the final word. And so I saw Roots in the Rushes for the first time today, and if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go and see it because it does something very extraordinary. It traces the arc of these baskets, from their origins as utilitarian objects such as the fanning basket, to the market basket, the vegetable basket, the bread basket, and to the new, sophisticated, fully remarkable works of art that they've become today in the hands of present makers. It draws the direct lines from that West African tradition with clarity, care, and intention. It puts the object in front of you and visually shows you its significance. And most importantly, it shows you what becomes possible when an institution decides that minding the gap is worth the work, when curators and scholars and makers come together and say that these objects matter, that their makers matter, and that this story has not been fully told, so that we are going to tell it. And so as I close today, I want to remind you of those women, and I hope that something that I've said today has put a new idea in your mind about baskets and the women and the enslaved women behind them. And I want to close on this story, and it comes to us from a woman named Mamie Garvin Fields, from her memoir titled Lemon Swamp and Other Places, a Carolina memoir. She was born in Charleston in 1888, and she told this story in her book about her Aunt Harriet. And it describes something that happened down in the low, wet, dark places of the Lowcountry, in the middle of the work that was demanded, in the space between, as Aunt Harriet calls it, what was for you and what was for we. And Aunt Harriet talked about how the women would go down and gather the rice, the enslaved women. They would hitch up their skirts and knot them. They would pound the rice and pour it into the fanning baskets and throw it into the air with that same motion, that same basket, that same knowledge that we've been talking about all evening. And as the rice came back down, they fanned it one way and then the other. And what fell into the knots and folds of their skirts was quietly and deliberately kept for their families, for their children, or as Aunt Harriet described it, some for you and some for we. And so that phrase stopped me when I first read it because it was so simple yet so profound. It was built into that very motion of the labor that the plantation required. But this act of resistance was so quiet, so rhythmic, so perfectly hidden in plain sight that it became a superstition before anyone fully understood what it was preserving. And so as Mamie was growing up, she was always told, do not sweep at night, because when you sweep at night, you can't see the floor, and you might sweep those grains of rice right out the door. And as her Aunt Harriet told her, those grains were ours. And so when I think about Mamie Garvin Field's story and Aunt Harriet, I'm also reminded that the stories that we tell matter, and that's Mamie Garvin Field's right there on screen. And when we think about how the stories that we tell matter, I'm reminded of this quote from author Margaret Atwood, because as she so wisely puts it, quote, in the end, we'll all be stories. And so how do you want your story told? And so some of you may also be saying, well, how do you accurately tell the story of Black craftspeople? And we start here with this series of questions that we made together on a Zoom meeting during the height of the pandemic. And we begin with, of course, who made the object? But we then move to questions such as how does the object currently speak to the craftsperson's continuing presence? What can we learn from the object? Who were the craftsperson's relatives? Who or what was the craftsperson's community? What relationship did the craftsperson have with other craftspeople? And so our object study questions allow for a deeper understanding of the craftsperson in the past while also examining the craftsperson and their work in the present. And so our object study questions seek to get at the heart of a craftsperson's life and experiences. We want to know how they gain their knowledge, how the objects they created impacted their reality, and how that reality and the work that they did was able to thrive and address the oppression that enslaved craftspeople lived under. And so recently, in thinking about Black women in particular, I've begun drafting sort of my own object study method, because why not? And good news, it's out there in a publication near you in just a few weeks. But chief among my thoughts is that an object study method for Black craftspeople must demonstrate a dedication to critically recovering silenced voices. It demands that we see enslaved Black craftspeople out of their enslaved state and see them as the creators of art. And it sees the beauty and labor of enslaved art in all of it, the tangible and the intangible, from bricks to horseshoes to food preparation arts to the decorative arts such as cabinet making, pottery, painting, and even basket making. And I tell people all the time that really you have to understand that doing this work is a bit like building a puzzle when all of the pieces just aren't there. Sometimes you won't find all of the answers. You won't be able to answer all of the questions. You will hit dead ends. You will get frustrated. You might even think that the work is too hard. And what I always tell my children, and one of them is sitting in the audience, is that just because we have to do hard things doesn't mean that we don't do them. It means that we adapt, we find new methods, we keep moving forward. And that's what I'm all about, is moving forward, and moving forward together, minding the gap together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Momon. That was a fantastic lecture. I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions before we end things for the evening. I'm going to open up the floor.
I was surprised, Dr. Momon, when you mentioned enslaved baskets. I'm sure I'm exposing my ignorance, but I just always assumed it was women.
Yeah, so when I went out looking for basket makers and turned to the newspapers, that's where I always started, the men always popped up. And they popped up in rates greater than women. And one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of them were elderly. And I began to wonder if that was just, maybe when you physically weren't able to do other types of labor, maybe that's what you then began to do. But yeah, it was very interesting. And I checked a few other, I checked the newest version of the BCDA, which comes out in June. And all of the basket makers in that version of the website are all men. So yeah, it was a thing. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you again. Dr.
Thank
Momon is
you.
fantastic.